Greetings, citizen. Welcome to the show, and thank you for listening. For more of the art of wargaming in your life, definitely check us out on Instagram and Facebook. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon account where you can do just that for as little as $1 a month. What we can offer will expand as the show does. If you don't have extra funds but would still like to help us out, you can give us a like, share, or 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. Want to get in touch? Feel free to message us or hit up our email, artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you because we know the world is vast, with many different ideas on tactics and strategy that can be applied to the games we enjoy.
You're listening to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network. The military maxims of Napoleon.
Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the Earworm Network. I am Malark. Today's episode is on the defense of swamps and forests as we continue to develop Clausewitz's concept of defense. Before we get into that, at the time of this recording, the situation in Krinky, in Ukraine, is devolving. So some of the information that I recorded on this episode previously may not be as relevant by the time that this one comes out. This next weekend. So bear in mind that if you go to look at this, you might go, oh, this information is a few days late. Well, this is partially why. Because as we were talking about in the previous episode, you'll remember when we spoke about the danger of bridgeheads, well, that danger is coming to pass currently in Krinky. So we will see how long that situation holds out. Yeah, it's been interesting to observe this principle in action in the flesh. So this particular episode this week is about the defense of forests and swamps. Now, as I mentioned a little bit further on, this is not something that Clausewitz knows a whole lot about. You think about the areas where he would have been fighting, and yes, there were forests, but particularly on the subject of swamps, he would not have had a whole lot of experience with this. And when we're thinking about the American Civil War and the forests that one had to navigate in the southeastern United States, or if we're thinking about Vietnam, or really any other jungle conflict where we're dealing with very, very dense vegetation and very harsh terrain, well, you find a bit more of this idea to be present. And of course, his analysis falls somewhat short because his scope, his experience was very much limited in this way. And so that's going to limit our analysis a little bit as well. But it's still a fun read, and I'm looking forward to sharing this one with you. But I think some wargaming stuff real quick. For those of you who may play Belagarth, you may know about the organization called The Great Hunt. And I believe I've spoken about it previously on this show. But it is an organization that is lore-based around this whole cult type thing. But the whole point of it is about self-improvement and the betterment of one's skill through proper combat. And by proper combat, I mean seeking victory, always seeking the edge, but also seeking to challenge oneself. And not cheapening the activity or cheapening the training by trying to take shortcuts. And so that's something that the Great Hunt really tries to encourage, and it really tries to stretch different skills. So if you are a person who does Belagarth and you have not heard of the Great Hunt yet, you can either email me here at the Art of Wargaming, or you can get in touch with somebody who is in your local realm. They doubtless will know somebody who is a part of this organization. It's pretty big. But I've been working on revamping it because I very much believe in its mission. And I have been inactive in it for entirely too long. So we're going through a little bit of a revival right now, and I'm already very pleased to see what is going on in my own realm and what is going on over in Durdemarion with those cats and the Great Hunt sect there. And there's a lot on the rise around the country. So check it out. We're having a good time. In terms of 40K, I finally bit the bullet, like I was talking about, and decided to get into some Voton. So I am going to be playing the Trans-Hyperion Alliance, and yes, I'm going to have my capital ship be called the Orchestra. One has to. But, you know, I was really drawn to kind of their lore, but honestly, the obnoxious orange that they have, it reminds me of what I was wearing in middle school when I was being accused constantly of not having a good fashion sense. And then later on in high school, when I found out that I was colorblind, suddenly those criticisms, they made a lot more sense. But yeah, they're fun. I love the little space dwarves. I like the rules. I'm enjoying the prospect of playing something that is a bit more infantry based, of playing something that is a bit more diverse when it comes to tactics, and it's not just whether or not I can do this one tactic or these two tactics really well, but having a bit more at my fingertips in terms of options. So this will be fun. And of course, I'm not getting rid of my knights. I've still got those. And I've been dealing with the wonders of trade. Right? International trade is infinitely more complicated, but I've been selling and buying models online, and my goodness, it can be a chore. What's worse than the people who scroll by and either leave a laugh react or just sort of make a negative comment where it really wasn't necessary. It was like, okay, you were just bored and needed to, ruin somebody else's day in some way or try to make somebody else feel bad. But worse than that are the people who get this close to closing a sale and then decide to back out at the very last second. Oh, so many of those over the course of this. And I finally found some good buyers, which is freeing up some funds for some overton. You got to try to use what you're not going to have to get what you do want. And I'm sure that made sense on some planet. But I think I've rambled for long enough, though. That's kind of what's going on for me. And let's get into this and discuss this evolution of our last episode as we talk about the defense of forests and swamps. During this section, we probably need to take what Clausewitz says with a grain of salt. Because when we're looking at the fields of warfare that he was involved in, there weren't a whole lot of swamps around. Europe, especially in the places in the 7 Years' War and whatnot, you don't find it. In Holland, he was talking about, is about where you're going to find the terrain that he describes here. Now, we know that many other fields, many other battles took place in far more swampy areas. Here in the United States, we had campaigns down in the southeastern portion of our country in places that could very well be considered swamps by his definition. And certainly we have the Everglades and the cypress swamps down there. And of course, let us not forget about the swamps of Vietnam, the swamps that were dealt with during the Island Campaign in WWII. There's swamps everywhere. So, what is a swamp by this definition? Well, he's defining it as certain lowlands and marshy banks of rivers. Because again, that's what he was dealing with. But if we think about swamps as being much bigger, a lot of these things still apply. But let's just keep that in mind. That when he's talking about swamps, he's not necessarily thinking about the swamps that some of us do, depending on where we live. Swamps are very much like rivers. And we're dealing with them. Like in the last episode, we talked a bit about how to deal with rivers, how to defend a river area. But he says swamps have three peculiarities that make them different and honestly harder than to defend than defending a river. So the first of these three peculiarities is that it is more difficult to cross. With a river, we can use boats to cross at the wider portions and get people to where they need to be. But in swamps, we are limited. A good portion of swamps, they are too shallow to allow the passage of boats, particularly boats that may be laden with men or laden with supplies, cannons, horses. Boats are just not practical in most swamps. The area is too broken up. But of course, you still need to move through it because it's a marshy, wet area. A lot of times in these swamps, though, you don't have established bridges. Or if you do, in Holland, there, of course, are the dikes. There's the ways of kind of separating the ocean from the farmlands that they have there. But in most swamps, we're not going to find established bridges. And so that means that we have to make a makeshift one as we go through, a plank bridge as you will. But of course, that only allows for the passage of infantry for the most part, unless we get in bigger pontoons. But getting the pontoons there is also harder, because we don't have the aid of being able to just float it across like we do in a river. So even just getting across the swamp is more difficult, because we don't have the things we normally could. We don't have our boats to get us there, and we don't have established bridges. We have to bring materials over and slowly make that to go over. So that's a peculiarity of swamps. The second peculiarity of the swamps is if we do get those bridges in place, they are harder to destroy. If we look at pontoons or other bridges, when we're crossing a major water system, a major river of some sort, if we begin to lose on the other side, if the enemy begins to advance and we need to pour back over, well, when we get back over, we can destroy the bridge fairly easily when we get there. And that means that we're preventing the counterattack or the surge of the enemy coming at. Now we're on the defense, on a strong side of the river. Now, of course, if we're dealing with dikes like they would in Holland, it's a little bit different. You can't really destroy one of those either. But because of this, we have to have a more local defense. We have to have a more passive defense, because trying to race around inside a swamp is not good for movement's sake. We're only going to have limited ways of getting through it. However, so will our opponent. But we do need to be stronger. We have to be stronger in a local place than we do with a river, because our enemy only has so many ways to go. That means that they're going to be pouring in strength if they do. So swamps are inferior in every single way to a river. We know that crossing rivers and dealing with rivers is a complicated matter. We dealt with that in the last episode. But swamps are worse in every single way. But let's talk about this third peculiarity. Now, he says in the defense of rivers that establishing a bridgehead on the other side of the river is a good idea. It's a strong defensive position if we can get it right. Allows us to move men and material back and forth between either bank, gives our enemy a headache, gives us opportunities to pursue counterattacks or flanking maneuvers should the enemy give us an opportunity. But we can't do that, or rather, we ought not to do that with swamps, because it takes so long, it takes so much toil to cross back and forth through a swamp, especially if you're trying to deal with ammunition or large quantities of troops. It is just very difficult. So if you have to retreat or if you have to reposition, the swamp being at your back is difficult, is bad. So, in this way, they are very different than rivers. In some ways the same. But, as we see here, based on these peculiarities, there are definitely significant differences that need to be taken into account when we're dealing with the defense of swamps. And you might be asking, why, when you said you were going to gloss over these things last episode, are we talking about swamps? Most of us will not be fighting in swamps. And in this next section, of course, we're talking about forests. And unless you attend some of the events, at least if you're in America, if you attend the events in the East where you are lucky enough to experience forest battles, they're awesome. But for the most part, in the West, where I live, we don't get forest battles. But we have to remember that it's not just wacky bats that are doing this. It's not just those of us who enjoy tabletop gaming. I should hope that a few of you might play paintball or airsoft. And those things can absolutely take place in forests and in marshier, swampier regions. I know that I played paintball in both of those regions. Got a couple leeches on me one time because I decided to go a-wading. The dangers of a swamp are quite real to me. So, this information may not be useful all the time, but it certainly will be useful some of the time. So, we're going to go over this a little bit, but not nearly as in detail as he does in the book. So, with that in mind, let's move on to talking about forests. Now, forests have changed a lot, or at least in terms of how we handle them, have changed a lot since the time of Clausewitz. Remember that when we're dealing with him, we're dealing with a time when artillery is king, when large troop formations are used to crush other large troop formations, when cavalry is more of a backup mop-up force rather than something that goes forth and punches holes for other people to go in through. And so forests and swamps present difficulties because line of sight is very important. When we're dealing with cannons, being able to see our opponents, be able to get an angle on our opponents, is very important. Forests completely hobble artillery. And when we're dealing with large formations of troops, it is easy for them to lose contact with one another, to get broken up, for one portion to get ahead of the other ones. And this endangers the entire army. So forests actually present a unique challenge at this time of warfare. But we know now, of course, in the more modern warfare, that forests are different. They still present a challenge, but with drones and aerial bombings, the artillery aspect isn't as important. And our artillery is largely computer-directed at this point. So as long as somebody knows where to go, just fire it up and have it come down where we want to. Not so at this particular time. And so forests were not good. So if we're dealing with a forest, if that's something that we have to deal with in this particular time period, it's something that we want to our rear. And you may think, oh, interesting, I would have thought that we'd be in it or we might be behind it. Well, let's explain Clausewitz's thinking here. We want to fight with the forest to our rear because at that point we can obscure any last-minute movements from our enemy. If they're coming at us, of course, from the front, or they're looking at us from across the way, and we're keeping a good portion of our forces in front of the forest, but we can move people back and forth. And so if they look at us and they're like, oh, it's an even line, we might have a huge amount of our force built up on our right flank, but they don't know, they can't see. And so this is a good way to use the forest, use it to obscure our rear guard movements. Because if we place the forest in front of us, if we are looking at it directly, we are blind, as I've said. Our artillery can't really do much. Cavalry can't really do much. We're waiting for our opponent to come at us, and at that point they have the initiative, because they can see us, but we can't see them. And if we were to set up in the middle of the forest, that renders both of us blind. So making sure that we have good positioning and are using the forest to our advantage is important. And this is when we're dealing with a forest that is on relatively level ground. That's an important thing to remember. Because if we begin to combine the idea of a forest with mountainous terrain, at that point we need to consider the mountainous terrain more so than the forests. It's more important at that point because the mountains are, well, as we've talked about before, they're their own rules when you fight for them. So mountains and forests together create a very complicated situation. Now, if we're talking about a forest that is impassable, that is due to thickness and roads must be used, then at that point we want to place the forest in front of us because we know where our opponent is going to come from. We can track. It's like, okay, well, this forest is way too thick for them to be able to walk through in any sort of order, which means they're coming down these roads. We can bottleneck them at that point. So at that point, we want to make sure that we're positioning. Now, of course, these words, this terminology doesn't work in our current way. There is no impassable forest for us because the vast majority of combat in this day and age takes place in small group tactics. We're not marching against one another with muskets. It's kill teams, it's squads that are going against one another in a concentrated manner. So forests are hazardous places to fight. Just in general, there is no getting around the fact that a forest is a hazardous place to be, no matter where we're positioned. Because wherever it is, even if the forest is in front of us, if it's behind us, of course, if we're in it, we're going to need a chain of outposts to make sure that we have eyes. And this chain of outposts needs to be more than we would normally have. If we're out in the open country and we're setting up our outposts in order to defend our flanks or defend in front of us, we can see fairly far if we're in open country, so we don't need to put them right on top of each other. We can have ways of signaling between them. So as long as that they're within sight of one another, they can still be useful. When it comes to a forest, we're still thinking the same way, but that sight is massively restricted. So at that point, those outposts need to be so much closer together, which means they need to be so much more numerous to cover the area. And it makes it hard, because at that point we also have imaginary barriers. These imaginary barriers, if we're just dealing with a forest, and we don't have a mountain to go up against, and we don't have rivers to pin up against, there's no real place to have our back. There's no real place to feel secure. But it's easy to try to feel secure because we can think of either the edges of the forests or as, certain areas like the thickness areas as being true barriers against our opponent. But as we talked about before, there is no woods that is too thick. And of course, he hasn't been to Vietnam at this point. But, he says there are no woods too thick for small group tactics to apply, for a small group of determined individuals to get in and do some disruption. So this is swamps and forests. And again, for a majority of us, we're not necessarily going to run in to the issues of a swamp or a forest in our particular world of wargaming. I know that we have forests within 40K, and they do kind of run by this rule. At least the way that the rules, the cover rules and the way terrain works right now, it is very much the same. If we've got it to our back, it gives us an ability to kind of move through there without having what's moving behind it shot at or visible, without having the forest be a consideration. If we are behind it, then our opponent can use it to get close to us. And if we decide to be in the middle of it, well, we end up fighting with our opponent on the inside. But the lessons that we can take away from both of these is that when our terrain is in some way hazardous, dangerous, or restricted, we can use it to our advantage. We just need to make sure that we're thinking about it in the right way, because fighting in swamps and forests is not like fighting in other places. There are similarities between a swamp and a river, and when we're thinking about crossing a swamp or dealing with it in terms of supply, it is best to think of it as a river, because we're going to have the same issues getting back and forth. However, there are more complications as well, as we heard in the 3 peculiarities concerning swamps. And they're big too. Like those considerations that we have there, those are big. And the same thing with forests. Forests kind of turn the rules on themselves. They give us limitations that we wouldn't normally have. And when we start combining them with other terrain types, think about a forest and a mountain like we're talking about here. At that point, the mountain, the rules of the mountain take over. But a forest next to a river? How do we set up for that? Well, how much space is between the forest and the bank? How visible is everything through the forest? Are there commanding areas nearby? And we're going to get into cordons and the keys of the country in next episode, which is kind of dealing with some of that. But if we start thinking about these forms of terrain in combination with one another, mountains that have rivers running through them, a river that has a swamp on the other side of it, all these things contribute to what a battlefield is going to look like. It is easy to think of a battlefield as just being a level, open plain all the time, but sometimes we don't have that option. It is preferable in most cases, especially if we have a force that relies on line of sight and mobility, which most do. Having that open area is good for us. Maybe having the clutter in the forest to be able to move behind, but being able to fight in that way. But that's not always going to be the case. That is not always where the campaign is going to be. The Spanish marching through Florida, trying to fight the Seminole tribes. Oh my goodness. Just running a circle around them because they understood. And when we start looking at some of these things, the other thing that needs to be taken into account, particularly when it comes to forests and swamps, is that a good portion of armies, a good portion of training, does not prepare you for the particularities of fighting in forests or swamps, or even mountains for that matter. But those who live there, those who have trained there, those who have studied that land and know that country, the rules are different. The forests open up to them and become ways of passage that other armies just can't even dream of. The swamps are familiar, and they can move through them with ease. Mountains, oh, mountains. Think about all of the campaigns that have been decided by mountains, all the places in the world that mountains have made a huge difference. A good example would be Ethiopia, which is the only country in Africa that was never actually colonized. And part of the reason for that is that Ethiopia doesn't contain a whole lot of super rich resources like they would have wanted during the colonial period. But the bigger issue is that getting into and out of Ethiopia is impossible. The way that their mountains are set up, the way that their terrain is, makes it nigh impassable for an invading army. But for the folks who live there, for the Ethiopians, and there are many, many different, I use Ethiopians as a blanket term, but there are several different ethnicities, several different cultures that make up what we would consider Ethiopia. But all of them run circles around those who have attempted to invade. We studied Afghanistan at one point, and the British occupation, the Russian occupation, and the American occupation of Afghanistan were massively complicated by the mountains. Without the mountains, the Mujahideen, and later the Taliban, wouldn't have been able to function with the same level of efficacy that they did. And they were able to do so because they were using the terrain, using the mountains to their advantage. Thinking about swamps and forests even more, we think about the American campaigns at Vietnam, which is another one of the wars that we lost. And the big reason that we lost it was because of the terrain. We just could not keep up with the VC and their knowledge of where they were and how to resupply. It was difficult. All the island campaigns were very much the same. The Japanese had a chance to get dug in, understand where they were. Americans were coming in fresh, trying to get them out. And obviously, there was a success there. But it was bloody, and it was hard. So when we're dealing with these situations, it is important to remember that even though our boy Clausewitz may not have had the breadth of perspective that we can now, having studied, war in the 21st century, it is good to remember that these are hazardous places to be, and that if one is commanding an army, we best not linger for long.
That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't had enough of the art of wargaming in your life, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, where I occasionally post funny and educational memes. If you want to get in touch with the show directly, you can email us at artofwargamingpodcast@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or concerns that you might have. Also be sure to check out all of our sister shows on the Earworm Network, including General Nerdery, Word Balloons, Fried Squirms, and more. We're working hard on having something for everyone. And again, you can find those at earworm.com. That's EARVVYRM. You can also find that in the show notes. But for now, this has been Yaga Malark, signing off.